I'd like to talk about A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams. First performed on Broadway in 1947, it has since been made into a film, adapted into a ballet, and even parodied on an episode of The Simpsons. But how did Williams create such a powerful play? And more importantly, what do we get from studying this work? But before that, who is Tennessee Williams? Like Arthur Miller, he is highly regarded as one of America's foremost playwrights. He was inspired by literary figures such as Hart Crane and William Shakespeare. However, he had a troubled personal life. His parents were abusive, his sister suffered from poor mental health, and he was openly gay at a time of extreme societal stigma. Now we look at a summary and analysis of the play. Set in post-war New Orleans, Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire dramatizes this tragic collision between the fading gentility of the Old South, embodied by Blanche DuBois, and the brutal realism of Stanley Kowalski. Scene 1. Blanche DuBois arrives at her sister's house in New Orleans. She meets her sister, Stella, and her brother-in-law, Stanley. The play opens in a dilapidated building that is weathered grey. Despite that, it has a rakish charm. The sky is turning into a tender blue, establishing an atmosphere of decay. Around the corner, a blue piano plays with the infatuated fluency of brown fingers. Here, Williams uses the setting of weathered grey houses to establish a working-class setting and visually hint at the brutal nature of reality. Furthermore, the background music of the blue piano played with infatuated fingers represents the spirit of New Orleans and conveys an atmosphere of emotional longing, as blues music was historically developed as a means of expressing and coping with feelings of melancholy and sadness. We open with Eunice talking to a black woman. Overlapping voices can be heard, including a vendor shouting "Red hot, red hots." Stanley and Mitch come along. Stanley is holding a packet of red meat. He bellows at his wife Stella. Stella comes out and asks Stanley not to holler at her like that. Stanley throws the packet of meat at her and she manages to catch it. Stanley and Mitch start to leave for the bowling alley and Stella asks to tag along. Williams' use of zoomorphic language in Stanley's bellowing hints at his uncivilized and explosive nature. Furthermore, Stanley's animalistic tendencies are underscored by the prop of the red-stained package of meat, with the color red connoting violence and primal desire. Williams' stage directions reveal that Stella manages to catch the meat and laughs breathlessly, illustrating her adjustment to a crude reality starkly different from a wealthy upbringing, and suggesting that she has embraced Stanley's brutish world. Moments later, Blanche arrives with a suitcase and Eunice asks if she is lost. Blanche says she was told to take a streetcar named Desire, transfer to one called Cemeteries, and ride 6 blocks to Elysian Fields. She is daintily dressed in a white suit with necklace and earrings of pearl, as well as white gloves and hat. Her uncertain manner suggests a moth. Williams' choice of costume for Blanche, a white suit with accessories of pearl, is sharply juxtaposed with the weathered grey houses of Elysian Fields, exposing her refusal to accept the loss of her previous wealthy life. The whiteness of a costume, compounded by the French meaning of a name, white, intimates that Blanche desperately struggles to maintain an image of purity. This is further crystallized through the metaphor of the moth. The idea of moths being drawn to destructive flames parallels Blanche's obsessive attraction to an illusory version of herself and foreshadows her inevitable descent into madness. Similarly, the streetcar named Desire that Blanche rides to Stella's house symbolizes how Blanche's longing for intimacy and love has driven her, quite literally, to Elysian Fields. Her transferring to another streetcar named Cemeteries hints at the death of a former life, or the name of a final destination, Elysian Fields, alludes to the resting place of heroes in Greek mythology. Through the use of names, Williams frames Blanche's journey as one that is at once tragic and heroic. This is confirmed in the final scene where Blanche retains an air of dignity despite being assaulted by Stanley. Now Eunice helps Blanche with her things. Blanche wants to be alone, so the neighbors go looking for Stella. Blanche notices a bottle of whiskey and tosses down a half tumbler, taking care to replace the bottle and hide any traces of her drinking. Stella returns home and they catch each other in a spasmodic embrace. Pretending that she doesn't know where the bottle is, she asks Stella for some liquor. She then asks where Stanley is and proceeds to be honestly critical about the place, noting that outside the house is a ghoul-haunted woodland of beer. Despite drinking in front of the audience moments earlier, Blanche pretends not to know where the whiskey is. Here, the use of dramatic irony creates humor and reveals the gap between the refined image Blanche projects and the emotional fragility she wants to conceal. Williams also highlights the difference between the two sisters' personalities by contrasting the poetic diction of Blanche with the matter-of-fact tone of Stella. While Blanche regards the neighborhood as the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir, alluding to a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, Stella flatly states that these are the Owland End tracks. Furthermore, the word haunted carries a negative connotation and reveals Blanche's condescending attitude towards the environment Stella lives in. The poem Blanche alludes to centers around the speaker's feelings of grief and mourning, hinting at Blanche being psychologically trapped by her past, such that her memories are like ghouls that continue to haunt her even in a new environment. Blanche reveals that the family's property, Belle Reeve, was lost because many old relatives had fallen sick and died, without leaving much money behind. She accuses Stella of being in bed with a Pollack, while Blanche was trying to keep things afloat. Stella cries and goes into the bathroom. Despite no provocation from Stella, Blanche launches into a lengthy monologue claiming to detect criticism from Stella's eyes. Williams uses this imbalance in the dialogue to highlight Blanche's defensiveness and desperation to absolve herself of any blame for the loss of Belle Reeve. This is further reinforced by her fragmented speech in I took and I saw. Her muddled speech suggests emotional instability and indicates that she has yet to process the trauma of the loss and death she has witnessed. Williams employs tactile and auditory imagery to render Blanche's experience of death visceral and immediate, as she describes blows taken in her face and body and recalls the hoarse and rattling breathing of her dying relatives. Similarly, through Blanche's personification of death as a grim reaper setting up his tent on her doorstep, Williams underscores the oppressive presence of death in Belle Reeve, as doorstep presents death as physical and inescapable, rather than a merely abstract concept. Blanche's attempt to shift blame onto Stella for being in bed with a Pollack illuminates the dichotomy between Stella, who has chosen to pursue her desires, and Blanche, who is compelled by a performance of gentility to repress her desires. Furthermore, the racial slur Pollack reveals her disdain for Stanley's immigrant background and working-class status, thereby emphasizing her attachment to social hierarchies and prejudices of the Old South. Stanley, Steve, and Mitch come over. Stanley is described with an animal joy and a person that sizes women up at a glance. The men talk boisterously about having a poker game the next day. Eunice shouts at her husband Steve from above, who heads upstairs. Mitch goes home. Stanley and Blanche introduce themselves, and Stanley asks about her background. Poker music is heard when Blanche talks about her late husband. When Blanche discusses her late husband, the stage directions of Blanche's head falling on her arms conveys the emotional weight of the events on Blanche. Williams deepens Blanche's emotional pain through plastic theatre in the form of the Vasuviana poker music that is audible only to Blanche and the audience. As later revealed in Scene 6, Blanche and her husband were dancing to the Vasuviana, where Blanche expressed her disgust over his homosexuality, leading her husband to run out of the casino and shoot himself. The recurring use of this music accentuates Blanche's feelings of guilt, as it suggests that Blanche continues to vividly remember this traumatic event in her past. Scene 2. The following evening, Stanley confronts Blanche about the loss of Belle Reeve, the DuBois' childhood home. Blanche is taking a bath. Stanley comes home. He expresses his shock at the messy state of the house. Stella explains that she is taking Blanche to Galatoire's for supper, since Stanley will have his poker game later that night. Stella informs him that Belle Reeve is lost, and Stanley grows suspicious. Stella asks Stanley to go outside with her, but he refuses. Blanche's obsession with bathing is a recurring motif that reveals her deep-seated guilt and her desire to rid herself of the past. Her desire to be physically clean parallels her wish to return to a state of innocence. Also, Williams presents the relationship between Stanley and Stella as one defined by dominance and subjugation. The phrase monkey doings evokes a condescending tone, as monkeys connote foolishness and inferiority, exposing Stanley's domineering attitude towards Stella. This air of superiority is further exposed through Stanley accepting Stella's kiss with lordly composure. Stanley's body language highlights the unequal power dynamic between the couple. Stanley expects Stella to be subservient to him, much as a subject is obedient to a king. Moreover, Williams reinforces this through the use of verbal irony in "Well, isn't that just dandy?" Sarcasm is insincere and dismissive, and Williams uses it to underscore Stanley's misogynistic tendency to mock and belittle Stella rather than engage with her in a respectful manner. Stanley's one-word responses, such as "how" and "yeah," also imply a deliberate lack of effort, insinuating a stark power imbalance in which Stella must constantly justify her actions, while Stanley can do as he likes. Blanche comes out of the shower. She flirts with Stanley. Stella asks Stanley to come out. Blanche asks Stella to get her some coke from the store and offers to answer Stanley's questions. Stanley runs through her stuff, including love letters from one boy. Blanche talks in a flirtatious manner. Stanley's suspicions are allayed and reveals that Stella is pregnant. Pablo and Steve come over for the poker game. In contrast to Stanley speaking ominously, Blanche's body language and tone are flirtatious, evidenced in her playfully spraying Stanley with her perfume and remarking on Stanley's big, capable hands. Here, Williams exposes the limited agency available to women in a male-dominated society through Blanche, who relies on flirting as a means to navigate the physical threat posed by Stanley. The scene ends with the recurring shouts of the vendor, "Red hot, red hot," and the blue piano growing louder. Williams uses the repetition of sounds as an element of plastic theatre to reinforce the oppressively loud atmosphere of Elysian Fields, where Blanche cannot escape danger, connoted by the color red, and her persistent loneliness, suggested by the blue piano. Scene 3. The night of poker erupts into chaos as Stanley gets drunk and hits Stella. The sisters have gone out and the men are playing poker. The kitchen is filled with a lurid nocturnal brilliance and is reminiscent of a painting by Van Gogh. Williams describes the man as coarse and direct and powerful as the primary colors. Stanley is losing and is getting impatient. Mitch goes to the bathroom. By alluding to Van Gogh's The Night Cafe, a painting known for its lurid, unsettling use of color, Williams elucidates the rawness and aggressive vitality of the poker scene. He further extends the use of color symbolism by describing the man as coarse and direct and powerful as the primary colors, emphasizing their unfiltered and pure masculinity. Thus, this scene encapsulates a post-war zeitgeist in which men, influenced by their experience of war, emphasize their aggression to affirm their masculine identity. While the men are described with vivid colors, Blanche is associated with the color white. Thus, Williams uses juxtaposition and color symbolism to hint at Blanche's inability to assimilate into Stanley's world, reinforcing the conflict between Blanche's world of faded gentility and Stanley's unrefined modernity. The sisters return around 2 a.m., but the men have not finished. Blanche meets Mitch for the first time. Stella goes into the bathroom, and Blanche plays music on the radio. Stanley comes in and turns it off. Mitch quits playing and goes to the bedroom. He chats with Blanche, and she asks him to put a lantern over a light bulb. The inscription on Mitch's cigarette case alludes to Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Browning, echoing Blanche's earlier reference to a poem, and establishing affinity between Mitch and Blanche. This is further reinforced by Mitch's affirmative diction in "That's right, they certainly do," and "I believe you are right about that," as it indicates that Mitch listens to Blanche attentively and shares a common perspective with her. Also, the colored paper lantern Blanche bought symbolizes her refusal to face reality, and Mitch's assistance with adjusting the lantern suggests his initial willingness to help Blanche indulge in her pretensions. When Stella comes out, Blanche turns on the radio. Stanley, now drunk, tosses the small white radio out of the window. They argue and Stanley hits Stella. The men stop him. Blanche takes Stella upstairs to Eunice's house. However, Stella later returns to Stanley in tears. The scene ends with Blanche being comforted by Mitch. Scene 4. The morning after the poker night, Blanche confronts Stella. It is morning and Stella lies on bed with narcotized tranquility, resembling Eastern idols. Blanche appears at the door after a sleepless night. Stella stresses that she does not want to get out of the relationship, as a physical attraction to Stanley makes everything else seem unimportant. Blanche argues that Stella should not follow brutal desire. Stella counters by pointing out that Blanche has also followed her desire, leading her to Elysian fields. Williams's reference to the narcotized tranquility of Eastern idols suggests that Stella is unusually calm about the situation, as though she has been subdued by strong drugs. This reflects Stella's complete acceptance of Stanley's bestial nature. Furthermore, the physical contrast between Stella's leisurely manner and Blanche's hysterical tenderness elucidates their conflicting attitudes towards desire. While Stella fully embraces her brutal desire for Stanley, Blanche's metaphor of a rattle-trapped streetcar reveals her disdain for such desires, as rattle-trap indicates crudeness and a lack of refinement. Ironically, Blanche admits to being led by desire to Elysian fields, exposing Blanche's hypocrisy. While both sisters are similarly governed by desire, only Stella embraces it openly. Blanche remains bound by a culture of gentility that compels her to deny her primal instincts. Stanley enters, but the sisters don't hear him because of the noise from the train. Blanche goes on a long rant and criticizes Stanley's animal behavior, calling him a brute. Stanley overhears Blanche's insults. Stanley goes out and calls out to Stella, pretending to have just arrived. At the end of the scene, the blue piano plays again. Williams's use of dramatic irony engenders tension in the scene, as Stanley, whose tyranny and capacity for violence has already been established, silently and stealthily overhears Blanche's harsh criticism of him. The stage direction of licking his lips intensifies the predator-prey dynamic, and his grease-stained pants further suggests a disregard for proper behavior. The scene ends with the sound of trumpets and the blue piano, emphasizing Blanche's entrapment in the primitive world that Stanley embodies. Combined, the use of stage directions and irony evoke an ominous atmosphere and foreshadow Stanley's sexual assaults of Blanche later in the play. Scene 5. The neighbors Steve and Eunice quarrel. Stanley hears a rumor about Blanche, which Blanche denies. She is excited about a date with Mitch. The scene begins with Blanche laughing over a letter to Shep Huntley, a former boyfriend. Upstairs, Steve and Eunice quarrel. Eunice runs down. Stanley comes around the corner, and Steve comes down looking for Eunice. Stanley asks Blanche whether she knows a man named Shaw, who claims to have seen her at the Flamingo, a disreputable and sleazy establishment. Blanche denies it. Steve and Eunice return, with Steve's arm around Eunice. In her letter to Shep Huntley, a character who embodies Blanche's fantasy of escape, Blanche uses idyllic language, describing spending summer on the wing and a continued round of entertainment, teas, cocktails, and luncheons. Such phrases evoke opulence and leisure, revealing Blanche's deliberate effort to project a refined, idealized version of herself. However, this is interrupted by the quarreling couple upstairs who resolve their argument just as quickly as it began. Eunice's abrupt shift from threatening to call the police to sobbing luxuriously echoes the earlier pattern of Stanley and Stella's conflict, suggesting that such volatile and raw relationships are typical of Stanley's environment. Therefore, the juxtaposition of Blanche's letter writing with the neighbor's domestic quarrel casts Blanche as an outsider, willfully ignoring reality in favor of romanticized illusions. Later, Stanley, Stella, Steve, and Eunice go out for drinks. The blue piano can be heard again. A young man drops by to solicit donations. Blanche tells him that he looks like a prince and kisses him. After he leaves, Mitch drops by with roses. Earlier in the scene, Blanche tells Stella that she puts a paper lantern over the light out of her fear of fading. Williams uses the symbol of the paper lantern to illustrate Blanche's tendency to obscure and soften reality, just as the paper conceals the harshness of the naked light. Later, when the young man comes asking for donations, the allusion to the Arabian Nights, a collection of folk tales revolving around fantasy and storytelling, further reveals her desire for an idealized magical romance rather than a genuine one. Scene 6. Blanche and Mitch returns from their date at 2 in the morning. Stanley, Stella, and a couple upstairs are still out. It is after their date. Mitch is holding a sort of prize won at shooting galleries and carnival games. Mitch appears depressed because Blanche doesn't seem entertained. Blanche insists that she tried to. She invites him in for drinks and tells him about how her husband died. They acknowledge their mutual need for companionship and embrace. Williams has Mitch hold a statuette of Mae West from a carnival game, alluding to the American actress renowned as a sex symbol. While reinforcing the play's recurring motif of games, Williams's choice of prop hints at Mitch reducing her to a sexual trophy rather than engaging with her humanity. Williams further suggests that one's destiny is governed by chance by connecting the symbol of stars to card games in Blanche looking for the Seven Sisters' consolation and imagining them as bridge players. Despite not feeling like it, Blanche attempts to be jovial with Mitch, claiming that women must entertain the gentleman according to the laws of nature, a phrase that frames societal expectations as rigid and inherent, and reveals how Blanche is bound by the gender role assigned to her in a patriarchal society. The irony of Blanche expressing her sexual desire in French, "Voulez-vous coucher avec moi?" and later resisting Mitch's advances on the basis of her old-fashioned ideals, evokes sympathy for Blanche, who is compelled by social convention to mask her desires instead of communicating them in a way that Mitch can understand. Scene 7. Blanche's birthday party. Mitch doesn't show up. As Stella decorates for Blanche's birthday and Blanche sings in the shower, Stanley reveals to Stella that he has uncovered the truth about Blanche's past. In the hometown of Laurel, she was no Lily, pursuing numerous affairs and was ultimately removed from her teaching post after becoming mixed up with a 17-year-old student. He has also told Mitch about Blanche's past. Blanche comes out and senses something wrong. While Stanley reveals the truth about Blanche, Blanche remains oblivious, singing in the shower about a paper moon sailing over a cardboard sea. Williams uses dramatic irony to underscore Blanche's willful ignorance and rejection of reality. The visual imagery of paper and cardboard, materials which are typically associated with being flimsy and weak, further highlights the fragility of Blanche's constructed world. Scene 8. The birthday dinner. Stanley's present for Blanche is a ticket back to Laurel. Stella goes into labor. The mood is solemn. Blanche tries to tell a joke, but no one is amused. When Stella tells Stanley that his fingers are greasy, he hurls a plate to the floor and insists that he is king. Blanche runs to the phone in search of an explanation from Mitch. The festive birthday decorations stand in sharp contrast to the dismal atmosphere and Blanche's tight, artificial smile, evoking sympathy for Blanche. Despite the supposedly joyous celebration, she is not genuinely happy and must conceal her emotional anguish. This is compounded by Williams's use of dramatic irony, which engenders tension and unease, as the audience remains aware of the reasons for Mitch's absence, while Blanche desperately seeks some explanation from someone. The sense of tension is further intensified when Blanche attempts to tell a joke, speaking in a lively tone suggested by exclamations such as, "I love parrot stories." Furthermore, her stage directions of whistling and throwing her head back further convey her earnest effort to lighten the mood. However, Stanley's monosyllabic response of "huh" and lack of attention renders Blanche's performance futile and highlights Stanley's casual humiliation of Blanche. Furthermore, the parrot in Blanche's joke possibly serves as a metaphor for Blanche, as the act of a parrot performing mirrors her situation of entertaining a man who belittles and mocks her. When Stanley hurls a plate to the floor and proclaims that every man is a king, the combination of stage directions and authoritative diction escalates awkward tension into an explicit display of dominance, reinforcing Stanley's position of power over the women. As Blanche makes the call, Stanley holds Stella in his arms and reassures her that things will be sweet once Blanche leaves. When Blanche returns, she points out how candles are not safe as they eventually blow out. Stanley pretends to have a gift for Blanche, but it is actually a ticket back to Laurel. Stanley reminds Stella how they were able to get the colored lights going when Blanche was not around. The phrase colored lights serves as a euphemism for sexual intimacy, and highlights their colorful and enjoyable relationship before Blanche arrived. The sound of Steve's and Eunice's bellowing laughter further suggests that despite Stanley's violent outbursts, his relationship with Stella is enduring, much unlike Blanche's short-lived relationships. Blanche returns to the cake and remarks that candles aren't safe as once they are blown out, they are replaced by electric light bulbs which allow one to see too plainly. Here, Williams uses the metaphor of a candle being blown out to illustrate the fleeting nature of illusions and that what inevitably follows is brutal reality represented by the electric light. With false amiability, Stanley presents Blanche with a birthday remembrance that turns out to be a ticket back to Laurel. The verbal irony of "I hope you like it" reveals his calculated cruelty towards Blanche at a point where she is emotionally vulnerable over the absence of Mitch, thus emphasizing his dominance over Blanche. The Vaso-Vienna starts playing as Blanche runs to the bathroom, clutching her throat. Stella criticizes Stanley's actions, but he goes into the bedroom and changes into a bowling shirt. Stella stops him from going bowling and confronts him. Suddenly, she goes into labor, and they leave for the hospital. The scene ends with Blanche chanting in Spanish. Blanche tries to smile to maintain her dignity, but runs into the bathroom where she is heard coughing and gagging. The stage directions of coughing and gagging suggest that the emotional pain Blanche feels at this point is too intense to be concealed, evoking greater sympathy for Blanche's situation. The playing of the Vaso-Vienna polka suggests that the thought of returning to Laurel triggers her past trauma. This is confirmed by Stella's acknowledgement that the mistreatment of Blanche by people like Stanley was what forced her to change. Hence, Williams portrays Blanche as a victim of systemic cruelty in a male-dominated world, rather than an emotionally frail individual. Yet, as suggested by Stanley changing into a brilliant silk bowling shirt, the cruelty experienced by Blanche often goes unnoticed, as Stanley's bright costume suggests that he is cheerful and nonchalant, despite having inflicted pain on Blanche. At the end of the scene, the polka music plays with a sinister rapidity, echoing Blanche's swift descent into madness. Furthermore, Blanche begins to repeatedly whisper in Spanish, "Alpine demise," indicating her mental instability. Given Blanche's obsession with social class, evidence in the derogatory use of the word Polak on Stanley, Blanche's switching to Spanish hints at the collapsing of her social order as she slowly confronts the reality of her fading status. Scene 9. Later that evening, Mitch drops by. Outside, a Mexican woman sells flowers. Stanley and Stella are still at the hospital. Blanche is drinking, but gets excited when Mitch arrives. She is quick to forgive Mitch, but Mitch is here to confront Blanche. He tears the paper lantern off the light bulb and demands to see Blanche in the light. Blanche can hear the Vaso-Vienna polka, but not Mitch. Before Mitch arrives, Blanche drinks heavily in an attempt to silence the rapid, feverish Vaso-Vienna polka, a motif that represents her unresolved past trauma and establishes an atmosphere of mounting tension. The music ceases upon Mitch's arrival, suggesting that he offers the possibility of relief from her psychological torment. However, when Mitch gives her the cold shoulder, the polka returns, implying that her trauma remains inescapable. This is further emphasized in the stage direction of Mitch tearing off the paper lantern that he once helped Blanche place over the light, as this illustrates his rejection of the illusions that sustain her. Blanche's frightened gasp reveals both her terror of confronting reality and her fear of losing a meaningful relationship. This moment becomes particularly tragic, where Blanche asserts that she did not lie in her heart, as the contrast between inside and out suggests that her feelings for Mitch are genuine and implies that her dishonesty stems from self-preservation rather than an intent to deceive. A blind Mexican woman comes around the corner carrying gaudy flowers that are displayed in the funerals of lower-class Mexicans. When Mitch tries to initiate sex, Blanche asks him to marry her. Mitch says that Blanche is not clean enough, prompting Blanche to chase him away and shout, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" The distant piano is slow and blue. The Mexican woman selling funeral flowers, described as faintly visible, serves as a harbinger of death, alluding to the death of Blanche's and Mitch's relationship and foreshadowing Blanche's impending destruction. The woman's blindness further parallels Blanche's refusal to embrace the truth. Mitch's attempt to initiate a sexual encounter despite refusing to marry Blanche recalls her earlier observation in Scene 5 that men do not admit the existence of women unless they are making love to them. Williams thus condemns the unfavorable position of women in society by revealing that Mitch is no different from other men as he too views Blanche as a sexual object. Mitch declares Blanche not clean enough despite her persistent bathing and efforts to maintain an image of purity, emphasizing how the strength of Blanche's illusion is dependent on the willingness of others to tolerate it. Blanche refuses to have sex with Mitch and cries out wildly, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" in order to chase Mitch away. Here, fire serves as a symbol of the destructive nature of desire and reinforces the earlier comparison of Blanche to a moth. Just as a moth is attracted to flames which endanger it, Blanche pursues desires that ultimately threaten to destroy her. Scene 10. Stanley returns home late. Stella is still in the hospital. Stanley rapes Blanche. Blanche is packing her things and murmuring excitedly as if to a group of spectral admirers. She lifts a hand mirror, looks into it, and slams the mirror face down with such violence that the glass cracks. Stanley comes back to get some sleep. Honky-tonk music plays. With a rhinestone tiara on her head, the stage directions of Blanche murmuring excitedly to a group of imaginary admirers depict her reveling in a childlike, innocent fantasy. She invites these admirers on a moonlight swim, evoking an idealized romantic escape far removed from the harsh reality of Elysian Fields, and thus indicating her increasing detachment from reality. However, this is juxtaposed with Blanche abruptly slamming down the mirror with such violence that the glass cracks, paralleling the shattering of her fantasy and emphasizing her emotional turbulence as she switches rapidly from one mental state to another. Furthermore, the white satin evening gown she is wearing is somewhat soiled and crumpled, implying that her veil of illusion has been damaged. Blanche tells Stanley that Shep Huntley has invited her on a cruise. Blanche says it would be divine to finally have privacy and be treated with respect by her ex-boyfriend. She indirectly calls Stanley swine. She further says that Mitch came back with roses asking for forgiveness. He asks her if this happened before or after the telegram, and when Blanche fumbles, Stanley knows that there was no wire from the beginning. He also knows that Mitch did not go back with roses because he saw him earlier. Stanley goes into the bedroom and then the bathroom. Blanche tries to call someone. Through the use of a scrim, Williams makes the back walls transparent and reveals the scene of a prostitute approached by a drunkard, only for a thief to go through the back, dropped by the prostitute excitedly. Stanley re-enters wearing his silk pajamas, and Blanche drops the phone. Stanley makes sexual advances. They struggle, and Blanche falls to her knees inert. Stanley takes her to the bed. Williams uses the backdrop to represent the vices of lust and theft, revealing how Stanley's ill intentions fit in the wider moral decay of Elysian Fields. By showing how her whole surroundings are steeped in crime, Williams emphasizes Blanche's sense of entrapment and evokes sympathy for her. Similarly, her attempt to defend herself with a broken bottle before falling to her knees inert accentuates her sense of helplessness and suggests that women are ultimately overpowered in the male-dominated society of Williams's time. Scene 11. Some weeks later, the poker players sit around the table. Blanche is sent to a mental institution. Stella is packing Blanche's things. The sound of water can be heard from the bathroom, suggesting that Blanche is bathing. The poker players sit around the table, and the lighting is similar to that in Scene 3. Eunice joins in from upstairs to bring Stella some grapes. Stella asks how her baby is, and Eunice replies that she is sleeping like a little angel. Williams uses the same lurid lighting as in the earlier poker scene to emphasize the rawness and vitality of the men. The dominant space occupied by the men compared to Blanche visually reinforces Blanche's inferior position in society. By echoing an earlier scene, Williams suggests that the world of Stanley, driven by primal desire, remains unchanged throughout the play, establishing a sense of hopelessness for Blanche. Unlike in Scene 3, however, Stanley is winning the game here. He remarks that one has to believe themselves to be lucky to hold front position in this rat race. The metaphor rat race, compounded by the recurrence of the poker scene, encapsulates the repetitive and dehumanizing nature of post-war life in America, where one must work endlessly to compete with others. Blanche comes out of the bathroom. Although Stella has made arrangements for Blanche to rest in the country, Blanche believes that she is going to Shep Huntley. As she gets dressed, she says she can smell the sea air and thinks about how she will spend the rest of her time on sea. A doctor and a matron show up around the corner. Blanche's blue robe, resembling those in old Madonna pictures, alludes to sculptures of the Virgin Mary by Della Robbia. An important figure in Christianity, the Virgin Mary is associated with virtue and honor. Williams therefore uses costumes to reinforce Blanche's enduring desire to reclaim her purity and innocence. Furthermore, he uses the sound effects of cathedral bells chiming to amplify Blanche's desire for renewal. This desire for renewal is further emphasized when Blanche says she can smell the sea and that she wants to be dropped into an ocean as blue as her first lover's eyes when she dies, as the recurring sea imagery evokes a sense of peace and freedom. Blanche discussing her death candidly also indicates that her aspiration towards freedom transcends the fear of death. Williams thus presents Blanche as someone that remains hopeful despite significant hardship. Stella and Eunice lead Blanche to the doctor. Upon realizing that the man outside is not Shep Huntley, Blanche retreats into the house. She stops inside the door and then moves towards the bedroom. Stanley tries to stop her. The matron enters the flat. Blanche rushes into the bedroom. Stanley and the matron follow her in. Stanley seizes the lantern and tears it out. Blanche screams as she tries to break past the matron. Outside, Stella cries and is embraced by Eunice. Blanche's stage directions throughout this sequence intensifies her fear and sense of entrapment as she moves through the kitchen fearfully, gasps when she sees the doctor, and slips back into the flat. Her back and forth movement on stage mirrors the inner turmoil in her mind, torn between the brutal reality of Elysian Fields and the uncertainty of a mental institution. This sense of entrapment is further reinforced by the character of the matron, described as a peculiarly sinister figure in a severe dress. The matron's forbidding demeanor juxtaposes with Blanche's elegant appearance, intimating that the fanciful illusions she clings onto are on the verge of being stripped away. Stanley's tearing of the paper lantern emphatically reinforces the destruction of Blanche's illusions, as the paper lantern is a recurring symbol of Blanche's refusal to face reality. Thus, Williams uses stage directions, costumes, and symbolism to portray the irreconcilable clash of values between Stanley and Blanche. Stanley runs out and asks the doctor to come in. Mitch tries to enter the room, but Stanley blocks him. Mitch lunges and strikes at Stanley and says, "I'll kill you." Stanley dismisses him and calls to the others, "Hold this bone-headed crybaby." Steve and Pablo calm Mitch down. Meanwhile, the matron has pinned Blanche down. Mitch's anger suggests that he knows about the rape. However, Williams juxtaposes Mitch's aggressive diction and wild gestures with him collapsing at the table and sobbing after Stanley remains unfazed by his outbursts, solidifying Stanley's dominant position in the hierarchy of this environment. This further implies that in Stanley's brutish world, even a man is unable to challenge his authority, reinforcing the hopelessness and vulnerability of Blanche's situation. The doctor enters. When he takes off his hat, Blanche warms up to him, telling him that she has always depended on the kindness of strangers. Eventually, Blanche allows the doctor and matron to lead her out as if she were blind. Stella calls out to her, but Blanche walks on without turning. Eunice places Stella's baby in her arms, wrapped in a blue blanket. Stella sobs with inhuman abandon. Stanley kneels beside her, and his fingers find the opening of her blouse. The music of the blue piano and muted trumpet swells. Steve remarks, "This game is 7-card stud." Blanche's declaration that she depends on the kindness of strangers signals her abandonment of intimacy with those closest to her, placing her trust instead in strangers. The phrase "whoever you are" can also be interpreted as a direct address to the audience, through which Williams employs pathos to elicit sympathy for Blanche, presenting her actions as the product of a world lacking in kindness rather than of her own flaws. This is reinforced by the stage directions. Blanche holds tight to the doctor's arm and allows him to lead her as if she were blind. The verb "allows" preserves her dignity, suggesting that she consciously chooses to trust the doctor after he removes his hat and becomes personalized. Although Stella calls out to her, Blanche walks on without turning, symbolically rejecting a world governed by brutal desire. By having Stella receive the baby in a blanket of pale blue, the same color Blanche wears, Williams uses color symbolism to hint at the replacement of Blanche's fading aristocratic world by Stanley's harsh realism, embodied by the child. The sound of the muted trumpet and the blue piano, along with Stanley's fingers finding the opening of Stella's blouse, echoes the atmosphere of sexual energy from the play's opening, implying that Stanley's world remains unchanged and underscoring the futility of Blanche's struggle. Finally, Steve's closing metaphor of 7-card stud, a game governed by chance, reflects Williams's critical view of careless society, in which fate is determined by luck and the whims of those in power. Overall, Williams resists a moralizing tone, refusing to present a simplistic dichotomy of good and evil. Although Blanche is institutionalized, Williams preserves her dignity in her final moments, while Stanley's destructive actions are framed as survival mechanisms forged through the war. Instead, Williams suggests that the tragedy stems from their inability to understand each other. Shaped by his experiences with his mentally ill sister and his own marginalization as a gay man, Williams does not seem to criticize desire itself, but the social structures that legitimize some desires and discriminates against others. Nearly 80 years later, the issues explored in the play, including mental illness, domestic abuse, and war, remain deeply relevant. In a world that is often unfair, Williams ultimately calls for the kindness of strangers.